Waitress plays violin for customer, then he makes a life-changing phone call. Hey, beautiful souls. Your support absolutely lights up my world. If you're loving these heartwarming stories, smash that subscribe button. It means everything to me. Here's my promise. I personally reply to every comment because I genuinely want to connect with you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. I can't wait to virtually meet you. Ready for today's extraordinary tale? Let's dive in together. The scent of garlic and basil hung thick in the evening air at Romano's, mingling with the soft murmur of conversations and the gentle clink of silverware against ceramic. Emma Martinez moved through the narrow aisles between tables like a ghost, her practiced steps silent on the worn wooden floors. The three plates balanced on her left arm seemed weightless after 2 years of this dance, the coffee pot in her right hand, an extension of herself. At 25, Emma had perfected the art of invisibility. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her apron crisp despite the long shift, but it was her eyes that told the real story. Eyes that held depths no one bothered to explore. She refilled water glasses and cleared plates with the fluid grace of someone who had once commanded stages, though the customers never noticed. They were too busy discussing stock options and merger deals to see the way her fingers unconsciously traced patterns across her serving tray, muscle memory refusing to let her forget what those hands had once created. In her tiny apartment, 6 blocks away, a violin case sat gathering dust in the corner, unopened for 3 years. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between orders, Emma could still feel the phantom weight of the instrument against her shoulder, could still hear the echo of applause that had once filled Carnegie Hall. But those memories belonged to a different Emma, one who could afford to dream. Alexander Stone barely glanced up when she approached table 12. His expensive watch caught the candlelight as he gestured emphatically, his perfectly tailored suit a stark contrast to the restaurant's humble decor. At 36, he carried success like armor, his presence commanding even in casual conversation. The numbers don't lie, he was saying to his business partner, Marcus. We're looking at a 30% increase in the first quarter alone. Emma had learned to read her customers like sheet music. Alexander was pure confidence, the kind that came from building an empire from nothing. His dark hair was styled with precision, his posture spoke of boardrooms and power lunches, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested the weight of that success wasn't always easy to carry. More wine? Emma asked softly, noting how Marcus kept checking his phone with increasing frequency. Please, Marcus replied distractedly, then suddenly at her for the first time that evening, really looked at her. Something in her voice, a quality he couldn't name, made him pause. There was wisdom there that seemed older than her years, a quiet strength that intrigued him. Actually, no, I think I'll stay a while. It's not like there's anyone waiting for me at home. Emma felt a pang of recognition pierce her chest. She knew that particular loneliness intimately. Sometimes being alone isn't the worst thing, she said, then immediately worried she'd overstepped. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. No, it's fine, Alexander said, and his smile was genuinely warm. You're right, though I have to admit, eating alone in restaurants always makes me feel like everyone's watching. They're not, Emma assured him. Most people are too wrapped up in their own stories to notice anyone else's. As she moved to clear Marcus's place setting, Alexander found himself studying her movements. There was something almost choreographed about the way she handled everything, a precision that spoke of training far beyond waitressing. You know, he said impulsively, this might sound strange, but you don't seem like someone who's meant to be invisible. Emma's hand stilled on the wine glass. For a moment, pain flickered across her features, followed by something that might have been hope. But then the professional mask slipped back into place. We all have our roles to play, don't we? She said softly, and walked away before he could ask what she meant. As the evening wore on, the restaurant grew quieter. Alexander remained at his table, occasionally taking calls, but mostly lost in thought. Emma had refilled his coffee twice and brought him tiramisu he hadn't ordered, claiming it was on the house for solo diners. You don't have to take pity on me, he'd said with a wry smile. I'm not, she'd replied. I just know what it's like to eat alone. Now she could hear him on another business call, his voice tight with frustration. No, that's not what we agreed on. The timeline was clear from the beginning. He rubbed his forehead, exhaustion settling into the lines around his eyes. When he finally hung up, Emma approached with fresh coffee. Rough day? She asked. Alexander laughed, but there was no humor in it. Try rough year. Sometimes I wonder if any of it's worth it. You know, all these deals, all these numbers. But what's the point if you don't have anyone to share the victories with? Emma paused in her pouring. What about your family? Parents passed when I was young. I built my company from nothing, but somewhere along the way, I forgot to build a life. He looked up at her again, and this time his gaze was searching. What about you? Family? Dreams? The question hit Emma like a physical blow. Dreams. She hadn't spoken about her dreams in so long the word felt foreign in her mind. I had dreams once, she said quietly, then caught herself. I mean, everyone does when they're young, right? What kind of dreams? Emma's hand unconsciously moved to her throat where a small violin pendant hung hidden beneath her uniform. Music, she whispered so softly he almost didn't hear her. Alexander leaned forward. You're a musician. The pain that flashed across Emma's face was unmistakable. I was. A long time ago. What happened? She was quiet for so long that Alexander thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, Life happened. My parents died in a car accident 3 years ago, left me with nothing but debt and my violin. I had to choose between keeping their memory alive through music or keeping myself alive by paying rent. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Alexander had built an empire, but he recognized the weight of impossible choices. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. Emma wiped her eyes quickly, professionally. It's fine. I made my choice. But as she started to walk away, Alexander called after her. Wait, what if you didn't have to choose? She turned back, hope and fear warring in her expression. There's a violin on the wall over there, Alexander said, pointing to the restaurant's decor. Play something, for a tip, a big tip. Emma's laugh was shaky, disbelieving. That's just decoration. It probably doesn't even. Try, Alexander said simply. What's the worst that could happen? Emma stared at him, her world balancing on the edge of possibility and terror. Emma's hands trembled as she looked at the violin mounted on the wall. It had been there so long she'd stopped seeing it, like everything else that reminded her of the life she'd given up. But now, under Alexander's encouraging gaze, it seemed to glow in the dim restaurant lighting. I can't, she whispered, shaking her head. I haven't played in 3 years. My fingers aren't. I'm not who I used to be. Alexander stood up, his expression gentle but determined. Sometimes we're exactly who we need to be. We just don't know it yet. With careful reverence, he lifted the violin from its display. To their surprise, it was real. Dusty and neglected, but real. Emma's breath caught as he held it out to her, and for a moment she just stared at it like it might disappear. Mr. Romano mentioned once that it belonged to his grandmother, Emma said, her voice distant. She played in the old country. Then maybe it's been waiting for the right hands, Alexander suggested softly. Emma's fingers hovered over the instrument, not quite touching. What if I've forgotten everything? What if I disappoint you? Impossible, Alexander said with such certainty that Emma almost believed him. The restaurant was nearly empty now, just a few lingering customers and the soft clink of dishes being cleared in the kitchen. Emma finally took the violin, and the moment it touched her hands, something shifted. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted slightly, and for the first time since Alexander had been watching her, she looked like she belonged exactly where she was. She tested the strings. They were horribly out of tune, but as she began to adjust them, her movements became more confident. Muscle memory, 3 years dormant, began to wake up. I should warn you, Emma said, attempting a smile. I used to play classical music, conservatory training, not exactly restaurant background music. Play whatever your heart wants to play, Alexander replied, settling back into his chair. Emma closed her eyes, drew the bow across the strings, and the first note filled the restaurant like a prayer. It was tentative at first, shaky, but then her fingers found their positions, and suddenly she wasn't Emma the waitress anymore. She was Emma the musician, the girl who'd once made grown men cry with her interpretation of Brahms, the young woman who had dreamed of playing with the Chicago Symphony. The melody that flowed from the violin was heartbreaking and beautiful. Bach's air on the G string, but played with a vulnerability that transformed it into something entirely new. Every note carried the weight of her loss, her sacrifice, her buried dreams rising to the surface. Alexander sat, transfixed. He'd attended countless charity galas, heard professional orchestras, owned recordings by the world's greatest musicians. But this raw, honest, achingly beautiful sound from a 25-year-old waitress in a small Italian restaurant, this was different. This was a soul speaking directly to another soul. As Emma played, tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. 3 years of suppressed grief, of dreams deferred, of feeling invisible, poured out through her fingers and filled the space between them. When the last note faded, the silence was profound, sacred. Emma opened her eyes to find Alexander staring at her in complete amazement. "My God," Alexander breathed, his voice barely audible. "Who are you?" Emma lowered the violin, her hands still trembling, but now from the rush of music rather than fear. "I told you. I'm nobody. I'm just—" "No." Alexander stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Nobody doesn't play like that. That was—" He struggled for words. "That was one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard." The few remaining customers had stopped their conversations to listen, and now they began to applaud softly. Mr. Romano himself emerged from the kitchen, his weathered face creased with emotion as he looked at his grandmother's violin in Emma's capable hands. "Mia Nonna would have loved that," he said in his thick Italian accent, wiping his eyes. "She always said her violin was waiting for the right spirit to wake it up again." Emma carefully set the violin down, overwhelmed by the rush of emotions coursing through her. Playing again had been like coming home after a long exile, like breathing after holding her breath for 3 years. But now reality was crashing back in. "Thank you," she said to Alexander, her voice thick with unshed tears. I needed that more than you know, but I should get back to work." "Wait," Alexander said, his mind racing. "You can't just play like that and then go back to serving coffee. That's insane." Emma's smile was sad but resigned. "Dreams are a luxury I can't afford, Mr. Stone. I have rent to pay, bills to cover. The music world is competitive, and I'm 3 years behind everyone else now." But Alexander was already pulling out his phone. "What if you weren't behind? What if you had a chance to catch up?" He was typing rapidly, his business mind shifting into high gear. "I know people, the Chicago Symphony, the Lyric Opera, private collectors who sponsor young artists." "Please don't," Emma said quietly, placing her hand over his phone. "I can't handle hope right now. Hope is what broke me the first time." Alexander looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fear beneath the resignation. He recognized it because he'd felt it himself, the terror of wanting something so badly that the thought of losing it again was paralyzing. "What if it wasn't about hope?" he asked gently. "What if it was just about what you deserve?" Before Emma could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID made him straighten up immediately. Margaret Chen, the director of the Chicago Symphony's Youth Development Program, someone he'd donated to generously over the years. "I have to take this," he said to Emma. "But please don't go anywhere." As Alexander stepped away to answer the call, Emma sank into a nearby chair, emotionally drained but somehow lighter than she'd felt in years. She touched the violin strings gently, marveling at how natural it had felt to play again. Mr. Romano approached with 2 cups of espresso. "For 30 years, that violin hung silent on my wall," he said, sitting beside her. "Tonight, you gave it voice again. Sometimes fate works in mysterious ways, no?" Emma nodded, watching Alexander pace by the window as he spoke animatedly into his phone, gesturing with his free hand. Maybe, just maybe, some dreams were worth the risk of hope. Alexander returned to the table with an expression Emma couldn't quite read, excitement mixed with something deeper, more thoughtful. He sat down across from her, setting his phone aside with deliberate care. "Margaret Chen wants to meet you," he said simply. Emma's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. "The Margaret Chen? From the Chicago Symphony?" "I sent her a recording," Alexander admitted, holding up his phone. "I recorded the last part of your performance. She listened to it while we were talking." He paused, watching Emma's face carefully. "She wants to offer you a spot in their emerging artists program. full scholarship plus a living stipend. The words hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious. Emma stared at Alexander, then at the violin, then back at Alexander again. That's impossible. Those programs have waiting lists years long. The audition process alone takes months. Not when you play like that, Alexander said gently. And not when you have someone willing to vouch for your character as well as your talent. Emma's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different. Not tears of grief or regret, but of something she was afraid to name. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this for a stranger? Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Because tonight you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Success isn't just about building something big. It's about recognizing something beautiful when you see it and having the courage to protect it. He smiled, and for the first time all evening it reached his eyes. Besides, we're not strangers anymore, are we? Emma laughed through her tears, a sound like music itself. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, Alexander said. This is just the beginning. The real work starts now. Practice, auditions, competitions, but you won't be doing it alone. Romano approached their table with a small wrapped bundle. Take this, he said, pressing the violin case into Emma's hands. Nona always said her violin would know when it found its true home. I think tonight it found that home. Emma hugged the case to her chest, overwhelmed by the kindness of near strangers who had somehow seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. I don't know what to say. Say you'll play again, Alexander said. Say you'll let the world hear what I heard tonight. I will, Emma promised, and for the first time in 3 years, she meant it completely. As they walked out of Romano's together, Emma carrying her violin and Alexander carrying a lightness he hadn't felt in years. Neither could have predicted how this chance encounter would bloom into a friendship that changed both their lives. Alexander would become Emma's most devoted patron, attending every performance, cheering from the front row as she rebuilt her career. And Emma, with her music, would remind him that the best investments weren't always measured in dollars. 6 months later, when Emma played her debut solo with the Chicago Symphony, she dedicated her performance to the stranger who believed in dreams when I'd forgotten how to dream. Alexander, sitting in the front row with tears in his eyes, knew exactly what she meant. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you to change everything.